Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on the art of selecting digital content to preserve, the first of a series of 2 webinars entitled From the Digital Dark Ages to a Digital Renaissance. I am Maria Pincus. I'm a virtual member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. I am honored to introduce today's speakers, Sarah Rhodes and Brenda Miller. Sarah Rhodes is the Senior Librarian at the National Geographic Library, where she is responsible for research support, coordination of society training programs, and the library outreach. From 2007 to 2012, she served as Digital Collections Librarian at the Georgetown University Law Library, where she managed web preservation, institutional and dataset repositories, and the Chesapeake Group Digital Archive. She has previously given presentations, panel discussions, and workshops for the American Association of Law Libraries, Computers in Libraries, Electronic Resources in Libraries, and the Canadian Association for Information Science. Brenda J. Miller, our main speaker for today, is curator of the Hartford History Center at Hartford Public Library. The Hartford History Center is home to the Hartford Collection, a non-circulating multimedia collection comprised of more than 100,000 books, images, and memorabilia that convey community life in Hartford, spanning nearly 300 years. Brenda holds a BA in History from the University of Connecticut and a master's degree in American Studies, Museums, Archives, and Communities from Trinity College, Hartford. She serves on the boards of the Connecticut Olmsted Heritage Alliance and the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, is a member of the Connecticut Explorer, Journal of Connecticut History editorial team, and serves on the Connecticut History Online Management Committee, a consortium dedicated to facilitating access to digitized primary sources and fostering digital stewardship among Connecticut cultural institutions. Brenda also serves as an advisor to the Connecticut Humanities Council's Public Program Committee. Now, some logistics about today's presentation. GoToWebinar does not have interactive chat capabilities, but if you wish to comment on today's session while it is in progress, you may use the Twitter back channel hashtag on the screen. Please type your questions for the presenters into the box entitled Questions. At intervals during the presentation, they will answer as many questions as time permits, as well as at the end. Questions which are not answered while we are on the air will be answered offline and responses sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded. You should be receiving an email with a link to the recording within 2 days. The presentation slides will be made available to you shortly after concluding the webinar. As I turn the presentation over to Sarah, there may be a slight delay.
Thank you, Maria. And we really appreciate the opportunity to facilitate this webinar today. This is From the Digital Dark Ages to a Digital Renaissance, the art of selecting digital content to preserve. And this term, Digital Dark Ages, really began being used about 15 years ago to describe the large-scale loss of our burgeoning digital culture at the time. And really, we still have a burgeoning digital culture. But at that time, no one really understood how to preserve our digital objects. So there was a strong feeling that what we were producing digitally was doomed to be lost. Today, we not only have knowledge about digital preservation, what it is and how it works, but we have international standards, and here in the U.S., national collaborative efforts to guide us. So today we're not peering into a digital dark age anymore. We're actually at the front end of a digital renaissance. So as Maria said, my name is Sarah Rhodes, and I am a senior librarian at the National Geographic Library in Washington, D.C. I am co-host today along with our leading presenter, Brenda Miller, who is curator for the Hartford History Center in Connecticut. Brenda and I first met last year when we were both selected to take part in the Library of Congress's inaugural Digital Preservation Outreach and Education Baseline Train the Trainer workshop, also known as DEPO. You can see DEPO's mission here. Essentially, the Library of Congress has begun working to create a nationwide network of trainers to go out into the library and cultural resources communities to encourage the active preservation of our digital information and digital heritage. And here you can see, here's Brenda and me back in 2011 when we met at the Library of Congress. So that's to say that what we're presenting today comes directly from the digital preservation training modules that were designed by the Library of Congress. Our program today is the first of what we anticipate will be a 4-part webinar series. All 4 webinars in the series can be taken together and can complement each other and inform the overall development of your institution's digital preservation program, but at the same time, each webinar can stand alone and be taken independently to enhance your knowledge of different aspects of digital curation. So here we have a list for your reference of all 6 of the Library of Congress's DEPO modules. Today we are going to focus on the first 2, identify and select. On November 14th, 2 of our colleagues from the DEPO Train the Trainer workshop will be hosting the role of long-term storage and digital curation, which will focus exclusively on Module 3 here. And in the spring, we've put forward 2 proposals for webinars to complete the whole module series, one focusing on protect and a final one focusing on manage and provide. So now that you know something about us, let's talk about you. We have participants today from across the country, from New York to Virginia, to Missouri, to Minnesota, to California, and all the way up to Alaska. And not only that, just like Brenda and I are from 2 very different types of libraries, we have a variety of libraries represented today. University libraries, public libraries, medical libraries, art libraries, at least 1 museum library, and archives and special collections. I point this out because it shows you the variety of institutions that are taking on digital preservation initiatives. And I also wanted to point this out because the content we're presenting is more broad than specific. Our aim is to provide you with a conceptual foundation for your program, something you can build on based on your own knowledge of your institution, its mission, and its priorities. So now, everyone head for your keyboards. We've got a quick poll. This is the first of a couple polls we're going to do during our webinar today. So if you could, please take a moment to describe your current level of knowledge or familiarity with digital preservation. You have just a few seconds to respond before we tally the results. Just let us know, would you say you're a novice, intermediate, advanced, or an expert? So I'll give you just a second. All right, so here are our results. We have 30% who would call themselves novices, 61% intermediate, 9% advanced, and 0 expert. So this is great because our webinar today, in fact, this whole program is really designed for beginners, you novices and intermediates. And I hope that our advanced folks will still get something out of our presentation today. So quickly, our outcomes. By the end of today's presentation, we hope to equip you with the skills to develop an inventory, your own inventory, of your current digital assets, as well as to create a document basically to document selection criteria for your own digital preservation program. On a larger scale, developing your inventory, documenting your selection policies is really the first step to help begin developing your overall digital preservation framework. And so with that, I'll hand things over to Brenda.
Hi, everyone. This is Brenda. I'm talking to you from Hartford, Connecticut. Happy afternoon. It is the first time I've done a webinar, and I'm accustomed to actually looking people in the eyes when I talk, so I can tell if I've gone off the deep end. But this is a good thing, and it's a learning curve for me, and I look forward to sharing with you what Sarah so beautifully expressed in the beginning of this intro. And thank you so much, Sarah, for that intro, and Maria, thank you for the introduction as well. I want to go over the first module here that we are going to be talking about today. This is the first of the 6 modules developed by the Library of Congress Digital Preservation Outreach and Education Initiative. And this is a fundamental concept of identify. Identification and selection, the 2 modules we'll actually be talking about today, lay the groundwork for the next steps by establishing the scope of digital materials that are both under your purview and within your responsibility as an institution to maintain long term. So we're going into identify, and here it's pretty basic. Why do we identify content? This is necessary to begin to establish scope. Before we take action, we need to know what we're aiming at. And the first thing to do is to take an inventory. We may have digital content that requires consideration that we don't even realize we have. The only really good way to raise awareness and to get everyone at your institution on the same page is to first establish the scope of the challenge. And since preservation is going to require an explicit commitment of resources, the best way to effectively plan is to find out the extent of what will be preserved. And this certainly was stressed with during our Library of Congress training program last year, was that you first have to forgive yourself. I mean, if you have not done this, I mean, just from this point on, but don't look back and say, oh my gosh, this is something you're going to start today, and we're just going to move forward and be very positive. Inventorying content is a foundation step for digital preservation to identify the extent of what you may need to manage. The information you gather at this stage may heavily impact selection, costs, and much of the work to come. Think about it. If you don't know what you're preserving, you can't possibly understand all the ramifications of how the content will impact the decisions ahead. And this, before you start, the question, who in your organization can help you? I think it's important, particularly large and small organizations, to get the word out that this is what you're going to do, that you're going to start doing an inventory of the digital content. Because often you might find someone's doing it already in your institution. If you're in a larger institution, you might find out that a volunteer, if you're in a smaller institution, has been making notes on what they have that's digital. I think it's really helpful if you start thinking of possible partners that you could collaborate with, perhaps in your community or in your region, both in the nonprofit and in the for-profit sector. I really think it's kind of good to do a quick scan of your environment and see who possibly you can pull in to help you as you move forward. And I think you have to tell people this is what you're doing. It's going to take a little bit of time. You're going to want your supervisor to know, or your board, that you're moving in this direction. I think it's a good first step. Inventory considerations. There are some basics here to consider when you set up your inventory. The content of inventory is key, not what you use to create it. First, your inventory must be captured. This information may have to be pulled from many other documents, but until it's collected, it doesn't do much good. So you really need to collect it all, not have it in countless files, perhaps. Make sure the method you use provides a simple format for sorting, listing, searching, and updating. The inventory must be accessible to both managers and all the team members who will be creating it and adding to it. Where would that be at your institution? If you just think for a minute, where would be that central location? You will be constantly adding to this inventory. Not only will you add more content as it becomes available, But in later steps, you'll be adding more information about the material and the selection decisions. And the inventory must be periodically updated to keep it current. This means it must be incorporated into current workflows and periodically reviewed by supervisors. Some tips. Don't get bogged down here in thinking you have to go out and find some fancy software or build something before you get started. This is fairly simple stuff. You need a table format and something already familiar to most of the people who will be capturing and using this information. Start with whatever you have on hand. If you have nothing, perhaps OpenOffice would be your best bet. Whatever you use, you will need to ensure consistency, comprehensive coverage, and clarity in your expectations for data entry. Okay, inventory scope. Stop to think about all the kinds of digital content currently available for long-term management at your institution. Are your archives receiving institutional records in digital form? If so, this could be a huge area that must be addressed for legal reasons. How about your special collections? Donors may have already included hard drives, computers, computer disks, or other media in their donations. And if archivists are collecting cultural heritage material created since 1995, there's a good chance that includes digital content. To document history for the future, we will need to manage digital material today for long-term access. What about scholarly content? Do you have electronic theses or dissertations? Do you have an institutional repository? With the recent requirements for data management plans for research grants, there's a sudden demand for digital preservation of scientific and research data. This also can be huge. And what about web content? Is there anything you need to capture and possibly version through the years? And then, of course, there's the content we have digitized ourselves for our users. How much detail to include? Your inventory will be tailored to your needs. It is probably best to start with general information to get an overall view of the scope, and then make another sweep through to capture more detailed information. You may find that this will take several iterations. For example, perhaps you will start with a list of the number of floppy disks, CDs, DVDs, and other media in your special collections, as recorded in your finding aids. But this list of media doesn't tell you what's on it. To find out what types of files and content are actually in these items will require much more investigation. So leave room for expansion when you first start your inventory, and start with generalities, incorporating more information as you are able. You may be limited by manpower and the locations and type of content to be inventoried. Be realistic, but get started and begin to incorporate this into your workflow so it becomes part of normal operations. Scope everything, but at this point, don't get bogged down by detail, not in the beginning. Format types. You will probably want to be able to sort your inventory by type of content at some point, as this has a big impact on how you manage the material for preservation. It's very helpful to include a format type column in your inventory with general format types such as these. Within a format type, if possible, include the range of file types. An example for text might be PDF, Word, Excel. For images, you might say TIFF, JPEG, PNG files. There are file-level tools listed in the resources at the end of this PowerPoint that can help you identify content. At times, you will encounter file formats that you don't recognize or know how to open, or even what type of material they represent, and identification can become difficult. Online registries such as Pronom, and that's P-R-O-N-O-M, can be helpful, and I apologize, I mispronounced that out there. This is a web-based technical registry to support digital preservation services. It was developed by the National Archives of the United Kingdom. That might be a resource you could find helpful. You could also use some of the tools listed in the resources we provide later. Jove is one, which is a combined project of JSTOR and the Harvard University Library to develop a framework for format validation. Additionally, you might start doing some web searches. That might become your best, another valuable source. Some of the formats you encounter will be obsolete. You will not be able to open them with current hardware and software. This provides both identification and selection challenges. If you do not know the content of the files and you do not have the resources to access them or expect have those resources in the future, then they may fall out of your selection process. At this point, though, do what you can to identify them and assess their value in case the situation changes. Then they may be able to be selected at a later date for preservation purposes. Okay, date considerations. Dating the inventory and noting when it was last updated will help people using it and may ensure that it's updated more regularly. The inventory should stay current with your content as it changes and grows. In particular, the creation date of the files and the dates or time period the content covers, for example, recent digitized images of stored photographs, will help in using the inventory and in prioritizing what you later select for preservation. Location issues. The location of the content needs to stay current. Documenting where the content is stored will be helpful when the content needs to be moved. For example, when it is deposited within the archives or moved to a new server or transferred to another holding facility, the inventory needs to be updated. And I have here an example entry that might help. On the left are the column headings that you might use. You can see I've included category. Other category entries should be such things as institutional repository or research data or web content or archives. The type of content is clear, and I've made a distinction between digitized images as opposed to born digital images, as that might make a difference in prioritization. I've also included the format of files, the extent, the location, and some dates. This example is of digitized images from special collections. Other information you might want to add here would include backup information, contact information, and the location on the server. So hopefully and understand you will get a copy of this PowerPoint at the end of this program. Identify outcomes. If you take these steps to identify your content, this inventory becomes the basis for managing your preservation decisions and implementation over time. It will be extremely helpful as a planning tool. You need to know how much digital content is coming in annually. Did you get 5 times as much this year as you got last year? Are you starting to get in videos or other type of content that is going to require lots of space and effort? That's important information when planning ahead, obtaining funding, and justifying staffing levels. Once you incorporate this inventory into your workflow, it will be a basis for everything else you do for managing digital content for long-term access. And now with the quick poll, I'm going to ask that it go over to Sarah, the screen view.
All right, thanks, Brenda. Okay, another quick poll. Everyone head for your keyboards. Again, you'll have a few seconds to answer this before we tally the results, but we'd like to know how many of you out there have a written, documented, and complete inventory of your institution's digital content or holdings. And this can be either a standalone document of just your digital collections or something that's integrated into a larger inventory that includes your tangible collections, as long as it's complete. All right, so we're tallying up the results. Okay, so 11% of you say yes, that's actually really great. 71% no, and 17% don't know. So these are interesting results and really not surprising. I think it's not that common for libraries to actually have a documented inventory of their digital holdings. So for those of you who don't have an inventory just yet, here are a few questions to ask yourself to jumpstart the process. First, what software do you have at your disposal to create an inventory? Like Brenda said, you don't need any expensive, specialized inventory software if you don't already have it. You can use a simple Excel spreadsheet or even a text table. 2, where should you keep your inventory and who all should have access to it? 3, think about staffing. Who can and should be involved with the creation and maintenance of your inventory? And finally, think about your normal workflows and where you can naturally integrate inventory updates into your regular accession or processing procedures. All right, so here we have a list of resources, and I wanted to remind everyone that you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint, and we'll also email out a list of resources to everyone who registered, so don't worry about very quickly, rapidly jotting down all these URLs. But what we have here and what we'll provide to all of you are some example inventories, some information about file formats and their identification, including the pronom links that Brenda mentioned. And finally, we have a couple of additional resources that we think are pretty useful, especially this tutorial, one tutorial, an online tutorial, Digital Preservation Management, implementing short-term strategies for long-term problems, and then a survey of institutional readiness, which is a good thing to take as you kind of begin this process. Now, right now it is 2:26, so we have a couple minutes and can take a few questions if anyone has any questions to ask at this point. I'll give you guys a minute to type. Okay, here we have a question. How do you get a realistic handle on scope for what needs to be included in the inventory? Are you there, Brenda?
Yeah, a realistic handle on scope. Well, you've really got to sit back and first list all the different types. And Sarah, please jump in here, but all the different types of possibilities for digital format. I mean, as I mentioned, web pages, institutional records. Are you mandated by law to keep digital records? Just, are you creating online exhibitions? And if you are, what is that, that's what you start listing. Are you receiving material from content providers outside of your institution, donations? Do you do oral histories? Are you holding that type of material in your special collections? And, I know, Sarah, you come from the law library background at Georgetown. Certainly you had a mandate there when you were doing work there to collect and preserve digital material. So
Absolutely.
In your mind, go ahead. Would you like to add to it?
Sure.
But the whole thing is, it might be and I think that's why it's best if you do this in a team management type approach, so you can bounce ideas back and forth about what is digital content and how many different forms it takes on. Go ahead, Sarah.
I agree. I think that in terms of scope, that's for you to answer based on your own organization, your own institution, your own mission. Is your mission, are you an archive, are you collecting, digital records versus a library that maybe has perpetual access agreements? Are you getting CDs and DVDs of data from that you've actually purchased from content providers? Those are the things that you need to include. And I would say that in terms of the scope, start at a very high level. Identify those different levels of content that come under your purview, and then get into more granular detail beneath each one. And you may find that some content areas require more granular detail than others. So you may get into more detail with, for example, your institutional repository data, or maybe the files that are generated from a digitization project that you invested a lot of money in, or the things that you've actually purchased, the digital assets that you've purchased. But you might not get into quite as much detail with, emails or things like that. So again,
but the email, they exist though. And that's the thing. I think, we're going to go do the select module next. And this is Brenda again. And this might help you then think about your priorities. I think with the inventory, it literally is like a data dump. List it. Start listing what you hold. You can prioritize your inventory as you go through the selection process. But for this first piece, for identifying, I think you just want to just start listing. Just start attacking it and thinking of all the kinds of digital content that you have in your institution that you will then kind of narrow down as you work with selection. Does that make sense, Sarah?
It does. And I have another question. When you talk about digital inventory, are you just talking about institutional records of various sorts, or are you including library materials such as e-books and e-journals? And I'll go ahead and answer that. Again, that depends on your institution. Yes, it does. A digital inventory would absolutely include institutional records of various sorts. Library materials such as e-books and e-journals, that really depends on whether or not your library is the steward of those materials. Do you own them? Are you responsible for their preservation? With e-books and e-journals, there are different collaborative preservation groups like LOCKSS and Portico. There are e-books and e-journals that are part of these kind of national collaborative efforts, and they have a preservation process in place. If you are just providing access to those materials through a subscription, you're not necessarily responsible for preserving them. However, if you have a perpetual access, perpetual license where you're actually given the digital files by the publisher and told, these are your copies of these digital files, I would say absolutely, that belongs in your inventory. That is something that you are the steward of and that you are taking responsibility of, just as you would for books, tangible books and tangible journals you would purchase. And I have another question, so let me take a look at this one. How is it relevant knowing if a collection was born digital versus digitized?
That's interesting. I could see where the format type, the fact that the born digital is your primary piece, Sarah, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. I might have to think about that in a bit longer than the 30 to 60 seconds we have here. But Sarah, if you have a response to that, because I know I could probably pull a wonderful answer if I could just grab hold of it. What do you think?
I think it's definitely relevant. If you have a digitized collection, you probably have multiple files, and you need to determine which you would need to have multiple files in your inventory. If you digitized a rare book, for example, you would probably have large TIFF master files and also derived, PDF or JPEG files. You would actually have multiple files representing the same content that would probably need to be documented and possibly stored in different ways. Another thing, I've heard an interesting argument that a digitized collection, some libraries consider the tangible original to be their master copy, which is kind of an interesting concept. My personal opinion is that you consider your TIFF, like your very high-quality, large master file, to be kind of your master. But that's another thing that might make it relevant. Born digital content is unique because it's not, and I'm hopefully not going to step into our part 2 here, but born digital content is unique in and of itself because it has properties that are unique to digital content. A website is born digital, for example. It has qualities that are interactive. It is multiple files that are put together and presented as a whole. When you go about preserving a born digital object, you need to think about how it was originally presented, how it was laid out, the type of software that was required to open it. You know, born digital items are sometimes created using proprietary software, so you really have to document, how is it created, what file type is it. That's where that information comes in handy. With the digitized content, you have a lot of control over what the file type is because you did the digitization yourself. So, and we have a few more questions, but we're going to head into the next part of our webinar, part 2, and then we'll take some more questions at the end. Those are great questions. Thanks.
Okay. So if you could hand the screen over to me, I'll start on that part 2. Thank you. I apologize for any delay. Now that was a good question. I think as we go into the second module, which is select, perhaps this can help too when you think about next steps. Okay, so what portion of the content will be preserved? Okay, this again is a fundamental concept of the Library of Congress's DPOE initiative, and identification and selection really lay the groundwork for establishing the scope of digital materials that are under your purview and within your responsibility as an institution to maintain for long-term access. Okay, now why select content to preserve? Long-term management of the materials is not cheap. It means more than keeping the bits somewhere. The whole point of preserving digital content is to enable long-term access, and that will mean making content accessible and usable over time, regardless of the format, the original format. We will talk more about this in our later webinars to be held later this year, but for now it's important to recognize that commitment to managing digital content over time is going to require time and effort in planning, development of policies, workflows, and sustainable funding. Knowing the scope of digital content to be preserved, including the possible growth over time, is an important factor in developing an appropriate approach for managing digital content for the long haul. Okay, now I know typically in the state of Connecticut I go out often to historical societies and small libraries that have historical collections that have fallen to them to take care of. But we do have different language, but it all pretty much puts us on the same page. And that is this is just an example of the different terms that we use: archives, appraisal and scheduling, libraries, selection, museums, acquisition. Again, if you haven't built a team to approach this, the whole digital preservation issue for your institution, it's a good time to do it now. And you want to look for different skills. You want people who are analytical. You want people who can communicate, because often you need to really work with your content providers in getting the message across. And you need people from your IT or technical skills. And again, I ask, if you're a smaller group, that you look to your board or volunteers. Certainly, I'm part of a large public library in an urban setting. Hartford's a very poor city, and the History Center has at present only one full-time employee. That's me. And so what I do is I often collaborate, and that's why I joined the Connecticut History Online management team, because it enables me to work with the Connecticut State Library, the Connecticut Historical Society, Mystic Seaport, and the Dodd Center at University of Connecticut on managing my digital collections and helping to educate me as I move forward and look down the road to, as we look in this state, to developing a digital repository where I could possibly store my materials that wouldn't just break my budget. So please consider forming a team and look inside and outside your institution for help and collaboration. Steps. Okay, when you go back to your inventory, here are the basic steps. First, review the potential digital content that has been specified in your inventory. Then define your selection criteria and apply it to the inventory. Document your decisions and then implement them. Think of this as a form of weeding. Be careful not to take or keep content that is not in your scope. So here we go. Here are things, your priorities. Here are some things to consider when prioritizing your inventory. Creating explicit criteria for selection makes it possible to be more systematic and consistent. Documenting your criteria is essential. Think about your mission. and I imagine everyone has a mission statement. This will outline the parameters of what you should consider. It may be that you don't want to include anything that is preserved elsewhere. In fact, that makes beautiful sense. Why incur the cost to preserve something that another institution is already moving to preserve? You may want to focus only on what meets the research criteria of your primary audience. You may have legal restrictions or collection development policies that should be followed. Once you have clarified how your institution's mission and values apply to the concept of what you want to preserve, then we're ready to move on to what you're able to preserve out of that overarching view. It may not be possible to review or select anything at once. And remember that this will be a process that you're going to be reviewing and reviewing and reviewing. If you're overwhelmed by the prospect, I think think of this in steps, your first step, your second step, and so forth. It may be necessary to develop criteria for prioritizing selection, which can be labor-intensive and resource-intensive. If you have a legal mandate to preserve content, that may have to come first. Otherwise, you might want to start with that which is easiest, or what is most significant to your user population. If, however, you have the resources to plow into this, you might want to start with your most extensive set of content, particularly if it's all one format, and that might be a good way for you to just get a hold of this. So again, I'm just repeating, but it's just a slide that I thought would be very helpful when developing. Think of your acquisition or collection development policy. Think of departmental criteria. Think of your core records and content types, your research criteria, your uniqueness, the value, and also consider whether it's preserved elsewhere. I know that when I do grants, if I mention doing any type of a project that includes digital images, the first question that I'm asked is, do these digital images exist anywhere else online? Are they accessible? And then the next step are they being preserved anywhere else? And that's going to become, I think, more and more standard. Again, once you have some clarity about your preferred parameters for selection, then it's time to consider practical aspects. So this is a slide, stop if or when the answer is no. Even if something fits your parameters, it still might not be reasonable to select it. In the first point here, we consider the content in view of your selection criteria. But then we have to get down further to the brass tacks. That might not be enough. If it is not feasible for you to preserve the content, if it is not possible for you to make it available and usable, it probably should not be included in your selection. Examples here might be you have degraded material or types of material that require far more expertise and resources than you have available. Selection starts at the beginning, and this is really connecting with your content creators. Use your criteria to plan for and coordinate acceptance of incoming content. For material that will be deposited by creators or is being donated to special collections and archives, the selection process involves interaction with creators to reach an agreement about the retention and ultimate transfer of digital content to the organization that will care for it over time. For example, if you're getting electronic theses and dissertations in Microsoft Word format, you may determine that your criteria requires them to be in PDF, PDA format instead. If donors are bringing you hard drives or CDs of content for your special collections, it would be ideal to review the content with the donors to determine what of that material is really important to them to be preserved, and then if it fits and meets your criteria. Managers of digital content may not have much experience with these kinds of interactions, and it's important to establish solid, ongoing relationships with creators of content. Be aware that most content creators do not have a clue as to what an archival format is, or how to create content that is likely to be manageable for long-term access. Education of content creators is very important. Working with them at the outset will save you many headaches later on. When you reach the selection part of this process, you're likely to find that you need to go back and do more identification work. Perhaps the entry in your inventory spreadsheet only tells you that the media included in a donor's collection contains old family photographs from a certain era. However, when you open up that media and look at the contents, you're likely to find many more files that the donor was unaware of, that he or she didn't even know they were in there, as you may need to sift through many directories to locate the files that the donors intended you to retain. This becomes a process. It is likely to require you to recontact the donors and meet with them to review the content. To avoid this problem, be sure that when digital content is donated from this point forward, you review all the documents on the donated media prior to the acceptance of the donation. Okay. Documentation. As you review your inventory with your selection criteria in mind, you'll find you may have to gather more information, and you'll certainly want to document which content fits your selection criteria and which doesn't. If your criteria specifies particular topical content, your descriptions are going to need to be at least category level. You may want to stop and get a handle on how much content you can expect in the next 5 years, for example, with electronic theses and dissertations. This information will help you plan. You may find that some material does fit your criteria, but only for a selected amount of time, such as university archives. And when meeting with donors, you may find that the donor cannot give you the rights to preserve and disseminate the content. So this needs to be recorded in the inventory, because obviously that's critical information. The outcomes of this process of going through this work is to gain a sense of control over what you have to deal with, what your scope is, and what your policies and priorities are for selection. This is critical to developing a sustainable program for supportive long-term access. By applying your selection criteria to your inventory, you will have more detailed information to work with in your planning. This analysis will also inform your work with donors and creators of digital content that you'll be preserving. An outcome of this could well be the creation of new submission agreements so that the content coming into your repository fits with your institution's mission and your selection criteria for long-term support. And that's really, that new submission agreement, I think is huge. And I think that might put you, to go this far. We do have some resources that Sarah will go over, and I think this is one where, many people start talking about copyright. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Sarah, and we can start with the next poll.
All right, Brenda, thank you. Okay, time for our final poll. And I did want to mention we had a really great question that came in who said, 11% means nothing to me. How many people are taking the poll? And so to answer that question, we have about 42 attendees participating, and we have about a 83% response rate. So that gives you an idea of what those percentages mean. Okay, so final poll. Does your institution currently have a written, documented selection or acquisition policy for digital content or digital collections? And again, this can be a standalone policy focused specifically on your digital collection or digital collections, or something that's actually integrated into your larger preservation programs, acquisition and selection policies. So I'll give you guys a couple more seconds and then we'll tally the results. All right, we had 88% voted out of 42 attendees. So 27% do have written, documented selection and acquisition policies for their digital content. 51% don't, and 22% don't know. So with that, again, we've got a few questions that can help you jumpstart the process of developing selection criteria for your digital preservation program. First, this is very basic but also really very challenging. Identify and rank the priorities your institution should use in selecting which content to preserve. Like Brenda said, if you have something that will be replaced in 2 years, the file will be updated or a new edition will come out, it'll be less of a priority than something you need to have on hand for a long time. Budget and staffing may also factor in. If it's a file format that's easier or less expensive to preserve, maybe it's a higher priority than that more complex file. Or if you've got rare or valuable content, that will probably take priority regardless of cost to preserve. Second, identify your team or committee. Figure out who all needs to be involved with setting these priorities and then carrying out the procedure. And finally, implement your selection criteria. Determine when and how in your existing workflows the selection process will be integrated. All right. So we've got some resources for you. As Brenda mentioned, rights are definitely a factor in selection. So we've got a few kind of high-level copyright overviews. And we also have a few more helpful resources relating to selection, records appraisal, and specifically we did have questions about digitization. So we have assessment criteria for digitization from Oxford University here. And like I said, we'll provide a resource list to everyone after the webinar today. So this slide, as we mentioned in the intro, today's webinar and our upcoming webinar on November 14th can be taken as standalone webinars, but we also envision that all 6 modules and all 4 of the webinars that we propose will be useful to you in a really concrete way. And we hope that you'll be able to use the information we're providing to develop and document your own program. And we've even got a plan outline for you that's very basic. And again, we'll send this out to you after the webinar to show you where and how these modules can actually fit together in workable program documentation. So with that, let's see what time it is. 2:51. We have some time for more questions. So I'll give you guys a minute. Please ask any questions that came up. Okay, we're not having too many questions come in. So what I'd like to do, kind of in closing, is to remind you that, you'll receive a recorded version, and there will also be a recorded version posted to the website. And if there's anyone who didn't attend today's webinar who watches this on the website, we want to hear from you as well. Here are my and Brenda's email addresses, our contact information. And we are definitely open to receiving your questions, talking to you after the webinar, and finding out how you're doing, how your plan is progressing. And we do have one question that just came in. Are there any tips on educating content producers? That's a really good question. Brenda, do you have any thoughts on educating content producers?
No, but I think that's the next step, isn't it? Is making a list for that, because it is quite a task, and thinking about how you put this into simple language so that your content producers will understand. And I almost think that's the next step for the DPOE, because that's critical, being able to communicate what you're trying to do. We run into that all the time over here. And so I think it's a good suggestion. Sarah, do you have? And we'll reach out to our other team members. I know they're out there listening as well, to see if perhaps they have some tips, and we could potentially email out some tips if we're able to pull something together. But if you have anything, Sarah?
I actually found a pretty amazing online resource that I can add to our list of resources that is really written for record producers as opposed to content producers, but I think the tips can apply. And it's something that at Georgetown we distilled down to a table to give advice on naming files, creating files, file formats to choose, version control, information like that. So I'll include that link on our resource list when we send that out. So we'll take a couple minutes and tweak our resource list after this webinar today, and we'll add that for you. And one more question. Do you have any suggestions for preserving digital projects or online exhibits? So that's a good question, and if you don't mind, that's Sandra. Let's see, Sandra Parker. If you could elaborate a little bit on digital projects. I can talk a little bit about online exhibits. Web preservation is fairly is something that we've developed pretty well in the digital preservation community. And there are some open source tools for web preservation as well as vendor provided services. A few are the Internet Archive, which operates the Wayback Machine, has a for-pay service called ArchiveIt, ArchiveIt. There's the California Digital Library. OCLC even has a web harvester. So there are tools available that will basically crawl online content, a full online exhibit, and wrap it up in what's called a WARC file so that all of those files stay together and are preserved. So that's one option you have for online exhibits. But digital projects, that can mean a lot of different things. So I hope that helps. And I think online exhibits, another thing to think about is the original for the online exhibit. Do you have a photograph, or do you have, what is the digital original that has been adapted, probably reduced to a JPEG or something like that for a website. So that's something that you would need to consider preserving, possibly separately.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So I think we should turn it over to Maria.
Oh, actually, I have one more. Sandra responded. Databases of content and metadata. So that's an interesting question. Data preservation is an emerging field, and it's something to keep an eye on. At Georgetown, we used a service provided by Harvard called the Dataverse. So I would explore that, and I can go ahead again on our resource list. I have a few data preservation resources that I can provide to you that will hopefully help. All right.
Okay. I have it as 2:57, so if we need to turn it over to Maria.
Okay. Now, yeah, we'll turn it over to Maria now. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Sarah back. I just got a message from the organizers that there's a technical difficulty with Maria's microphone. So I'll just go ahead and wrap up. As you can see here, there's a list of upcoming ALCTS webinar opportunities listed here. And again, we thank you for your time today.
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't unmute myself. That was the problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So thank you, Brenda and Sarah, and thanks to Amy from the Technical Support Subcommittee from Atlanta, and Vicki Brzezinski and Julie Reese from the ALCTS office for their assistance. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. And thank you for helping out Sarah when I didn't remember to unmute myself.